So welcome back to another episode of Explain Yourself. I'm here with Wieteke Holthuijzen. She's another master's student here at Northern Illinois. So thank you so much for being with us and talking to us about all of your science and stuff.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for having me.
So the first thing that we like to ask everybody is, can you give us your elevator pitch for your current research?
Yes. So my current research is focused on studying the impacts of invasive species on islands. And specifically, I'm looking at the broader ecological impacts of invasive house mice on a small subtropical atoll in the northwestern Hawaiian Islands called Midway Atoll. And it's the world's largest albatross colony, but recently we've had problems with house mice that are starting to predate them. So consequently, we're going to eradicate mice, but there's a lot of questions about how the system as a whole will respond to that. So that's what I'm looking at with my research broadly.
Awesome. Okay. And we just talked to another person who does sort of similar stuff. So, but we, because there are differences in your research, we can have a lot of different questions to ask.
Oh, yeah.
So I guess my first question, a lot of people might have heard of Midway before because like World War II and stuff. So can you give us more of like the historical context of like how humans have interacted with this island or this atoll ecosystem and like what that means for the things living there?
Yeah, definitely. So Midway has a pretty long history of human activity and also human disturbance, which really start back at the start of the 20th century when folks came out there on a more permanent basis to build a telegraph line that went from San Francisco all the way to the Philippines. And so when people were out there for like on a more permanent basis, they had to be able to sustain themselves. And so consequently, you know, they brought things from home, which was a lot of plants. They also brought in a lot of food-related species in order to like have a garden and grow their own food. So over time, when you look at like really the amount of species diversity on Midway, you see this really fast growth in terms of the amount of invasive species that have been brought in just because people have been interacting with this place for such a long time. Of course, that really increased a lot during World War II and the Cold War. So that has a lot of implications now because since Midway's closed down as a military base or a naval base, it's now a national wildlife refuge. So the emphasis is much more on wildlife and really island system restoration. So that is a bit of a challenge when we have many, many invasive species and very few native species, and when we start to have problems like mice eating albatross.
Oh, great. So you mentioned that you're specifically interested in the albatross colony on Midway. So can you tell us more about albatross? I feel like that's a bird maybe a lot of people sort of have heard of before, but don't necessarily know a whole lot about.
Sure. So albatross are a fantastic seabird species. They're sort of like our poster child of seabirds in that they are these incredible large-bodied birds that spend most of their lives out at sea. They have delayed sexual maturity, they have very low fecundity, meaning that they're really slow to reproduce over time. But in terms of like ecology, like we kind of think of seabirds as like our canaries of the sea. Like, by looking at them and studying them, we can get an idea of what's really going on in these really large habitats, really large, expansive, diverse habitats like oceans. So that's, sorry, like I was like, where was I going with this? But anyway, yeah, albatross, Midway colony. Okay, so sorry, let me start over with that.
No, you're
continue. But Midway is home to like the world's largest albatross colony. There's more albatross on Midway than anywhere else. We have more than 1.5 million albatross that breed out on Midway every single year.
Wow.
So it's a lot. In addition to lots of other species, like in total we have over 3 million birds that breed out there every single year from 25 different species. So Midway, as tiny as it is a really globally significant seabird colony as a whole. So that, like as a bird nerd and also as an ecologist, is a really interesting point, especially when we have invasive species and we're trying to figure out how to restore places like Midway, how to bring them back to become like a robust seabird colony, but also account for these invasive species and account for the layered history that is part of this place.
Yeah, it's a complicated context.
Yes, yeah. Definitely. Yeah.
And the other thing you mentioned you're interested in is that these albatross and the other seabirds are being preyed upon by house mice.
Yes.
And I don't normally think of house mice being like predators. Like, sure, maybe they eat like insects and things, but mostly we would think about them eating like grains and plants and stuff. So what's up with them and the birds?
Yeah, it's a very odd and unexpected thing. We've seen very limited cases of mice going going after seabirds on islands. Mainly, though, it's been mice going after smaller chicks that are somewhat defenseless, that are relatively small for a mouse. I mean, it's still, seabird chicks are large, but on Midway, it's unique and also concerning in that mice are going after adult albatross, specifically during the breeding period when they're sitting on their nest and they're incubating their egg. And we think that there's several reasons why that could suddenly start happening. I mean, this is really something that's really cropped up in the last few years. One of the issues, or at least one of the contributing factors that we think is leading to this sort of phenomena, is that we've had several anomaly years in terms of weather, where we've had really decreased precipitation. And we've been seeing that more over time with climate change, that some more like normal, conditions are becoming increasingly abnormal. So our winters have been very dry, which has resulted in a decreased amount of vegetation cover, and we think might have led to crashes in invertebrate abundance or seed abundance or any other food source that the mice are using. We've also been treating certain invasive plant species very aggressively on Midway, and that has really altered the amount of cover that's available. So with these massive changes in vegetation cover, we think that's also had an impact on invertebrate abundance and composition, and together with really dry winter times, mice might have undergone a prey shift and started to select albatross instead because they're there. And albatross are like many seabirds, they've evolved in isolation, so they don't have this anti-predator response. So if there's a mouse crawling up on them, like, they might get annoyed and shift around and try to get off their nest, but they will not leave their nest, and they may not respond like as you or I would, or like a bird on the mainland, which would be to freak out. But so that's another problem. It's just like the behavior really of these birds makes them extremely vulnerable to mice and other mammalian predators.
So that's something that, like, most of the people in this research group who are doing this stuff with the birds on the islands, like, the process of evolving on an island means that your behaviors and things are very different based on what you were or were not exposed to in that sort of micro ecosystem, right?
Yeah, that's exactly it. So, I mean, that's one of the great joys of being able to work on a Midway, is that we have these species that are somewhat easy to approach, like albatross, where they won't run away from you. It's awesome. And they're also phylopatric, meaning they nest in the same place every year. So it's great for doing long-term work. But conversely, it also makes them really vulnerable to a myriad of issues. So hence the mouse problem.
Yeah, and it sounds like one of the things that I think is most interesting about your research is that you've got this mouse problem. So the mice were like unintentionally or accidentally introduced by people, and some of the plants were intentionally introduced and some were unintentionally introduced. And then you've got this like mess of climate change sort of wrapped up in it. So this whole story is how humans have accidentally affected the environment, right?
Right, absolutely. And I think like another important caveat with Midway, and for lots of other areas that were active in terms of restoration, is when you have a system that's been so highly altered, you can't really go back in time necessarily. We can't go back to 1902 when there were a dozen native plant species. Like, it's just not going to happen. We can't go back to that point because we've bulldozed entire parts of the lagoon and we've brought in hundreds of species. So now the question is more of how can we create quality habitat for the seabirds that are out there and all the other life. And it's a tricky question. I mean, and of course it's compounded by the fact that we have historical resources out there too, and it's really key to keep those as well, because we don't want to forget that, because Midway was so pivotal in World War II that it's really, I mean, that's part of the designation of Midway now as a refuge. It's also the Battle of Midway National Memorial. So taking all that into consideration makes restoration really tricky, but also fascinating and super exciting.
Yeah. So I love that you're working with invertebrates because bugs are my jam, right? So what are you doing specifically to look at the changes in the invertebrate population, or like what are you looking for?
Sure, yeah. So this is kind of there's two parts to the work that we're doing. So one is, mice have never been really studied on Midway. So the first question that we have in trying to figure out what kind of ecological impacts that they've had is to just figure out what they're eating, because by what they're eating, that's what they're affecting. So we will be determining mouse diet through sort of two methods: stable isotope analysis and DNA metabarcoding. But beyond that, though, we want to know what exactly is going to be changing once mice are gone, because that's going to have big management impacts. And so one of the things we're interested in, of course, are invertebrates, because invertebrates are important food resources for some of the bird species that are out there, like endangered lace-necked ducks. They have a really big impact on our vegetation communities. So what we want to look at is essentially, broadly speaking, invertebrate community composition and abundance. And there are a couple different islands on Midway. There's Sand Island, which is our bigger island, and Eastern, and one island, Sand Island, has mice and the other island does not. So it makes for a nice setup. And so right now we're setting up all these pitfall traps to capture ground-dwelling insects that are more likely to be consumed by mice, and seeing how things look right now before the eradication, and then repeating the study after the eradication to see what's going to change, because we know that mice are having direct impacts, likely, on lots of invertebrates. Like, they might be going after like large, slow-moving things that are a nice easy snack, like beetles. So we would expect to see some differences there, but we're also curious about the indirect effects that they're having, and we hope to tease that apart after the eradication. So I'm excited.
Yeah, and I know you're just sort of getting into the nitty-gritty of all of that molecular stuff, but can you explain a little bit more what the stable isotope analysis means, and also what DNA metabarcoding is?
Right, yes. So DNA metabarcoding, I guess I'll start with that, because that is essentially giving us species richness, an idea of what mice are eating. And so what you can do, what we're doing, might sound a little bit depressing, but essentially we're just getting mouse poop, we're getting mouse colons. We extract DNA from that, and from there we make lots of copies of the DNA through amplification for certain regions of species that we're interested in. So those are called primers. They're like a marker that is basically helps you identify a species, in simple terms.
Okay. So it's like a string of genetic code that is very specific to that species.
Yeah, it's like it's found among like lots of different species. So for example, if you want to use like an invertebrate primer, it's a region of genome across, or a region of the genome across invertebrates that they all have.
Okay.
But it's slightly different, so you can at least like tease apart different species.
Sure.
So we're going to use specific primers for invertebrates, for plants, and then through the magic of bioinformatics, you can essentially get the sequences of the DNA that's present in your colon sample, and then you can match it to things that have already been sequenced, various species. So at the end of it, you have basically a list of what are mice eating.
Nice.
Now the problem is though, like getting proportion of diet to figure out how important certain diet items are is a little bit difficult with DNA metabarcoding when you're using multiple primers, and there's more like technical difficulties in terms of like sometimes DNA doesn't really amplify well, and you have degraded DNA, so that can make things difficult. So that's where the stable isotope analysis comes in, because basically that applies this idea of you are what you eat. And so we have mouse hair samples that we'll be getting, and then we'll be doing stable isotope analysis to see like where is like the carbon and nitrogen coming from in terms of their diet. Like, are they eating lots of insects? Are they eating lots of plants? So together we can hopefully get like a really good comprehensive idea of like what mice are eating. And then that informs our ecological monitoring then. So we can look at like specific things that we know for sure mice are impacting, rather than kind of going in blind and saying like, well, they're eating something, I guess we'll just like monitor all the plants, but that's impossible. So we have to be specific, and that's the idea with this project.
Nice. And the stable isotopes that you mentioned, you're using specifically an isotope of carbon and an isotope of nitrogen, so those are specific, I guess, types of those atoms that persist through the food chain?
Yes, so they're naturally occurring isotopes, and they occur in different amounts, like as you go up or down the food chain. And animals tend to metabolize the lighter isotopes much more quickly, and so if you look at like basically like what kind of ratios of carbon and nitrogen isotopes are present like in these mouse hairs, you can tell a lot about where their food is coming from, or at least like from like what trophic level.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sure. So like plants tend to have more carbon type stuff, and like nitrogen is really important for building proteins, so like an invertebrate or some other meat source would have more nitrogen.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Cool. Awesome.
Yeah, yes. It's very exciting. So much chemistry and molecular biology going on.
So let's, we'll sort of take it back a little bit now, because we've talked about your current science, and I know that you've spent a lot of time on Midway doing stuff, and that's how you wound up doing this for your master's project. But I'd like to know more about how you decided to become a scientist in general,
Sure.
and why specifically you decided to go to grad school.
Ooh, so many good questions. I grew up in a really science-oriented family. I mean, both my parents are foresters by trade. My dad's a wildlife ecologist. My sister got her master's in restoration ecology, and she's studying climate modeling right now. So everybody, I grew up in a really, very curious house, and we were very outdoorsy. And I mean, I grew up birding with my dad, and so I was always interested in thinking about science. But then as I started to go through high school and college, I started to see that science wasn't just a fun hobby anymore, but it was kind of an obsession, especially birds, because I just couldn't get enough birds. Ever since I was a kid, I just had been completely obsessed with them. I remember my godfather gave me a bird ID book when I was in the 2nd grade, and I carried it around with me everywhere at school. And the teachers were kind of concerned because they're like, she's looking at this picture book like she's not reading. But I was learning how to identify birds, and I got in trouble for reading a bird ID book. So anyway, I think it was a good sign. But yeah, so then when I got to college, my dad told me, if you really like this, you need to go out and get experience and just see what science is really like. And so then I started doing field work, and then all of a sudden I figured out this is what I loved. I loved being outside and seeing these concepts of science come to life and starting to draw conclusions and ask even more questions and try to understand how the world works around me, especially with birds because they're awesome. So yeah, and then from there, I grew up in Idaho, and I had kind of always thought that I would just end up working there. I love the state. It's a beautiful sagebrush steppe area where I grew up in. But I always have been kind of curious about kind of the exotic world beyond Idaho. Crazy. And I remember I came across a volunteer job to work out on Midway doing seabird work, and it just sounded absolutely insane. Hanging out on an island for half a year with millions of birds. I couldn't even imagine it. So on a whim, I applied for it, and I saved up all throughout college in order to get there. And then finally when I graduated, I applied, thankfully got the position. They took a chance on me because I'm not a seabird person. Worked with tiny warblers. And then I remember during my interview, I asked so many dumb questions. I thought that they were dumb because I had no idea, being a mainland person. I was like, can you see the ocean from everywhere on Midway? How tiny is it? And they're like, no, it's big. You'll be fine. So anyway, I got out there, and it was just a completely transformative experience because I couldn't even imagine that there were places like Midway that still existed where you are the visitor. This is a thriving bird colony, and they are everywhere. There's burrowing seabirds underground. There's albatross every square meter. There's great frigate birds in the trees overhead and white terns that are following you like big butterflies. It was just unreal. And so then I was hooked. I knew that this was a system I would want to work in for a long time. And so ever since then, I've been working on Midway or in association with Midway, and can't get enough of it. And now I'm doing my master's degree. It just kind of came through the work that I'd been doing previously on Midway, and when the mouse eradication project came up, we were just lucky. We were able to join on as collaborators and help with the ecological monitoring, and I'm here now in Illinois, studying Midway.
The great exotic locations outside of Idaho, like
exactly.
the Midwest.
I'm slowly exploring the world, yes.
It's a nice place to be.
It's great, yeah.
And as part of you coming to grad school, you are a recipient of the Graduate Research Fellowship Program funding.
Yes.
So talk to us about writing grants. Because I don't think that's something we've really talked about with anyone before on here. But for those who are interested in what grad school and the research life is like, grant writing is a really
big deal. Yeah. I think that, yes, I would say if you're going into graduate school, be prepared to write lots of grants because it's really hard to find funding. Science is important, but the funding is not always there. So you have to get creative sometimes in how to get things done. I guess it was more than a year before I actually started my master's. I started working on trying to get my funding secured, and that was when I started talking with my advisor, Dr. Holly Jones, and she brought up the National Science Foundation's Graduate Research Fellowship Program, which is specifically geared towards graduate students and supporting their science. It's a relatively simple application process.
Well,
It's not. But it sounds simple, but I mean, basically you have 3 pages to talk about yourself and why you are the next, budding scientist.
that was the hardest part, I think.
It's horrible.
3 pages to tell them how great you are, and you're like,
and all the research you've done, and it's not fun, but it is important to do, and it's important to get comfortable with that. And then you have only 2 pages to outline your proposal, what you want to do for your whole master's degree, which is really tough, especially if you are not even starting and you have to come up with a whole robust study design and anticipated outcomes and what kind of outreach you're going to do. So I worked on that. Put together this proposal and was really lucky enough for it to actually be selected. So, but the thing is, as nice as that grant is, we're still going after other funding because doing research is expensive, especially when you're doing any kind of laboratory work, or if you're working in really isolated places that are hard to get to. You have to be able to secure additional funding to get yourself out there and also collect the data and send it back. So. I would say it's a very important skill to become comfortable with writing and to become very articulate in what you plan to do, and also making sure that your project makes sense to lots of different stakeholders, that you can make the case for it, not just for yourself, why you think your research is awesome, but why the public might care, why eradication practitioners might care about this, why federal or state agencies might care. So that's something I would definitely encourage folks to become more literate in, is thinking, I guess, from different perspectives about your project and how to get people involved.
It's an excellent point to mention stakeholders. Even people who are doing pure science, we tend to, in this department, talk more about application science, but even when you're doing pure science, someone needs what you're doing, and it's often more than one someone. I like that idea of sort of thinking about who all those people are and what about your research they would care about, and then each one of those grants that you write has to be tailored to what part of your research they care about.
Right. And that also dovetails really nicely with outreach, because sometimes outreach, we think, yes, it's the public and it's K through 12 or something, but outreach is so much more broad than that, and really these grant applications are your outreach in a sense too. So it's when you look at science from this perspective, it's a really big project. There's so much more involved than just what looks like to be collecting data and analyzing it. It's a very multifaceted endeavor for sure, but it's exciting.
So all those kids out there who go into science because they don't like writing, you still have to do.
You still have to write a lot. You'll get better at it. That's fine. Yeah.
You also mentioned your field work. I like to talk about field work because I think field work is fun.
Yes.
So tell us about your field work. What is your favorite part about it? What is your least favorite part about it?
Okay. Well, currently I'm not out on Midway, obviously, collecting my data. Somebody else who is fantastic through Island Conservation is. But typically, when I've been out on Midway, field work entails a lot of different things. Sometimes we do albatross demography work, so we get to go out to the albatross that are nesting and check on how their nest is doing, if they have an egg or a chick, and how big the chick is, and we band a lot of birds in order to keep track of them over time and their survival. I also did a lot of work on laysand duck management and monitoring. So laysand ducks are highly endangered on Midway. They're also very susceptible to botulism. So I spent a lot of time looking for sick ducks and then also helping to rehab them once they were sick. And of course, I should mention lots of invasive plant work. So that was a lot of weed pulling and also weed spraying, which is lots of fun. So sometimes ecology work is not always so glamorous, but that is just the way things go. So I guess in terms of my favorite part, working with the albatross is always awesome. It's a joy and it's an absolute honor to just even see these birds that breed in really remote places that nobody can really get to, and then to just behold them. It's quite the experience, and it's a little bit bizarre because when you're out on Midway, you're surrounded by them. They're everywhere, and they just walk by you like it's no big deal. Sometimes they get kind of curious and they come up and they nibble at your hair, or they pull on your pants or your shoelaces, and then I'm just gushing. I'm freaking out. How many people could say they've had an albatross pull on their shoelace or try to preen their hair? So that's, I think, definitely one of the best parts. But I think I think one of my favorite parts was working with the lace-end ducks because they are a species that's been pushed to the brink of extinction multiple times, and now they're recovering. It's slow, but they're doing good. It's like this bright spot of conservation is when you see recovery of species. And I just remember one day in particular, I was out doing duck surveys, and I counted over 100 of them at like this one little wetland.
Nice.
And I was just thinking, it's crazy that we had a species that dropped to less than 20 several decades ago, and now we've got hundreds of them. And that, I think, it's a very humbling moment. Like, it really hits you that you're doing important work, even if it's just counting ducks, looking for sick ducks. But I mean, it is actually really important, and it makes a difference. So I think those are the kind of moments I really treasure. Other times when it's not so fun, birds are brats. Sometimes they're total brats. And on Midway, we have bone and petrels, which are fantastic. They're these not small, they're like a dove-sized bird. And they're like moths to light. They're insane. They come back from the ocean at dusk after foraging all day, and then they fill up the sky like passenger pigeons, and they are absolutely fantastic birds. They're kind of crazy, but they're crazy in that they burrow underground. Like, they make these really massive, like, cavernous systems where they nest in, and it's great, but it's terrible if you're walking around at all, because you will fall into these burrows if you're not careful, and then you need to dig them out and like excavate everything and like try to reconstruct it and like put the bird back in. So it's a little bit stressful walking around sometimes, especially when you have like a big like 10-gallon pack of herbicide, you're trying to spray stuff and you fall into a burrow. That's a little frustrating.
Okay.
And also you feel terrible because you just destroyed a burrow. So we try to be extremely careful with that, but that's like the less fun times where it's like, there's lots of birds, it's great, but sometimes they are a little annoying.
Yeah.
So, yeah, but they're awesome.
Yeah. I liked what you said about sort of the rewarding feeling of helping out the ducks, and it's crazy to me to think about that species might have been reduced to only 20 individuals.
Yeah.
But I guess people outside of ecology and conservation might wonder, well, why do we care about that specific species going extinct? So what, for you, or more broadly, for the ecosystem, what is the value of those ducks or of, being concerned about any species going extinct?
Right, yeah, it's an excellent question. And it's one, I think, that's of great relevance to islands, especially because islands are not only places where we see incredible amounts of biodiversity, but they're also places that are really vulnerable, and we've seen insanely high amounts of extinction. And that's especially true for the main Hawaiian Islands and beyond, is that these places have seen dramatic declines in avian diversity in particular, due to invasive species that have been introduced over time, either on purpose or accidentally. We've seen on the main Hawaiian Islands with problems with cats and mongoose that have gone after a lot of native Hawaiian birds that are actually really important for pollination and seed dispersal. But yeah, I think that the story of the lace-end ducks is one really of hope and not just recovery, because even though they've been pushed to the brink of extinction by our activities in the past, we, in the process, have restored a lot of habitats, like not just for ducks, but for a myriad of species. So when we talk about recovery of species, it's never something that occurs kind of like in an alone or like isolated way. I mean, the work that Fish and Wildlife Service and lots of other folks have done for these ducks is benefiting a myriad of species. And so I think that's an important perspective to keep in mind when talking about these ducks, is like, we're not just managing for them, but we're really looking at these systems as a whole. So that's kind of my pitch for the ducks.
Yeah.
And they're so cute.
Well,
they're my favorite. They're quite adorable.
And another bird that people may or may not have seen in the news on those islands, you said you'd work with Albatross, but Wisdom is on your islands, isn't she?
Yeah, so Wisdom is a really neat bird. She's a lace-end albatross. She's been breeding on Midway since the 1950s, when she was first banded. That was back in 1956, and at that time when they banded her, she was already a breeding adult. She was on a nest. So they didn't really know how old she was at that point, but they thought at least 5 years old. She was rediscovered years later, still breeding in the exact same spots, and they rebanded her with a new band that had like really nice, clean, crisp numbers. And so we've been keeping an eye on her every single year, and most years she still comes back and still keeps on like laying an egg most years and raising a chick. And she has the amazing title of being the world's oldest breeding bird in the wild, which is pretty crazy because we don't even really have a good idea of how long albatross can live or how long they might breed. And I mean, Wisdom is well into her 60s and is still breeding. So it's really quite incredible because we have to wonder, I mean, that's one bird out of the millions, and we just have to wonder, you know, were some of the birds out there around during World War II, and like, what have they experienced? Like, it's incredible that these birds have gone through so much and are still like thriving out there despite all these changes and alterations to Midway's habitat, but they still keep on clinging on. So yeah, it's truly an honor to be serving birds like Wisdom.
That's amazing. And I think that illustrates really strongly the value of doing things like the surveys of the nests and banding the birds, right? That's how we have that long-term data.
Exactly. Because if we don't do that kind of basic monitoring, it's really difficult to gauge like what's going on with these populations. Like if we're not keeping track of them, we don't know what will happen over time. So yeah, I think it's incredibly important to just do just these basic monitoring jobs, because there's still so much we don't know about the biology of these birds, which is crazy to me.
Yeah.
But I mean, in general, we don't really know a whole lot about marine systems. So the opportunity is ripe right now for doing lots of research and really cool science on these kind of places.
Nice. Switch gears a little bit and talk more about your experiences as a scientist. So one of the goals of this series is to sort of show people what a scientist looks like, and that any and all of us can become scientists if that's what we're passionate about. So could you talk a little bit about how your background and experiences and any diversity categories that you might fall into have affected your experience as a scientist?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I think so originally, when I was going to college, I had not really expected on going down the scientific route. I was really always interested in science and, of course, birds. But I was really concerned more about environmental issues and sustainability, and so that was the avenue that I went down for quite a while and did a lot of work on sustainable lifestyles and policy on campuses, specifically at the University of Idaho. So I worked a lot with food systems, waste management, and it's still something that I really care about. But like through doing all of that kind of more like hands-on work and more like socially focused work, I started to see that like I had a major gap in my understanding between like how environmental issues arise and manifest themselves and solutions to those problems. And so really what's like underlying that is just like a basic understanding of science. And so I found myself like going back towards that end more and more, like in order to think of, you know, sustainable solutions to problems, like how do we reduce the amount of waste that the University of Idaho produces? I found myself going back to thinking about it from a scientific point of view, like trying to figure out like what are our exact questions here and how do we collect data to solve this problem. It's crazy how that works. So that's how I started to get more and more into like basically that's my pathway into science. And then of course like there was the whole Midway experience, incredibly transformative, got totally hooked. But in that process too, I mean, I ended up doing policy work, and I worked in Washington DC for a while and did lobbying for protected areas like Midway, specifically National Wildlife Refuges managed by Fish and Wildlife Service. So that kind of opened up another perspective for me of not just like understanding science, but like applying it in terms of management and broadly into policy, which is something I still really care about. But again, like that really reinforced to me that in order to make effective policy, you really need to understand the natural resources of the places that you are advocating for. And so that was the time when I decided, yes, I need to go back and get a master's degree in order to speak about these places with knowledge and consideration and application. So that was my trip back into school.
What would you want to like go back and be able to tell yourself at the beginning of your journey? So what would what advice would you give, or what warnings would you give, or what would you want to tell your younger self to watch out for, that kind of stuff?
Those are good questions. I think the first thing I would definitely tell myself is to always ask lots of questions. I mean, don't don't be afraid, because I know I'm somebody, I sometimes become a little bit silenced by things because I don't understand what's happening, but that's exactly when you should be asking questions. And I think staying really curious about the system that you're working in. Like, never assume that you understand everything that's going on. Like, you should always be like reading everything you can. Like, I can't emphasize that enough, especially natural history. Because sometimes we tend to focus on peer-reviewed work, but if you can come across like anecdotal observations, those are fantastic resources, especially like Midway. There's been lots of really interesting books that have been written about it that give you great insight into how the system has changed over time and kind of explains why we have the things that we do now out there. So I think, yeah, staying curious, asking lots of questions is absolutely critical. And also not doubting yourself. I mean, if you have passion for something, things will work out, but you just gotta stick with it. But I mean, on a more serious note, I will say too that being a woman in science is sometimes a little bit of an intimidating role. And I think for most of my projects, I've always worked in somewhat of a male-dominated realm, and that, like, supervisors usually have been men. It's no offense. It's how it currently is. Not to say that, you know, is the best way, but and I would say I've had good experiences, but I've also had some not great experiences. And so, especially for young women who are going into science, my advice is to be careful and to know your rights. To also know exactly like how human resources works. If you have a problem, that you know where you can go to report problems, and that you should absolutely speak up if something is going wrong. You should never assume that this is just the way that things are. Never assume that. If something in your gut is saying that a situation isn't safe, it's probably not safe, and you need to report it. Absolutely. It can be very scary when you're a small young undergrad and you don't really know what's going on and you just want to do things right, but your safety is more important than what you're doing. Like,
yeah, that's an incredibly important point. We're here because we love what we do, and that means that we need to take care of ourselves and make sure that we are doing the thing we love in a space that is safe for us.
Exactly. Yeah, safe for us and also safe for others. Like, I think that definitely is a important point to make. That, I mean, look out for yourself, but look out for others too, because you are also a solution to situations that are not ideal always. So yeah, definitely try to foster a nice, safe, supportive environment wherever you work.
And we wind up being much more productive when we can focus on our science.
It's crazy how that works. Yes, absolutely.
And sort of to skip off of that, giving advice to others, you are also interested in science communication and science policy, like I am. So can you tell us a little bit more about some of the SciComm stuff that you've done already, or what you're interested in getting into?
I've done a couple different things. I just did Skype a Scientist for the first time, which was fantastic. I can't say enough fun things about that. It's a blast because kids will always ask excellent questions, and it's good to write those down and think about, you know, potential PhDs that you can do with those questions, because they're really good. I love that because it's a way of giving back and getting like that passion going for science, which is sometimes can be kind of dry in K through 12 education. It's tough. There's a lot of material to cover, and sometimes science it doesn't seem that exciting because you're not in the field experiencing it. So I love those experiences when I can get them. And then I also do letters to a pre-scientist. So I have a pen pal that I write to, and, you know, just getting to know them and what they're interested in life, and hopefully, you know, encouraging them to pursue whatever career they're interested in. Hopefully science. But, you know, anything's good. As long as, you know, the idea is like to develop really like critical thinking about the world and to stay curious, like a student for life. So I do that. I've also done outreach kind of broadly about Midway and Albatross through a book that my good friend wrote, Karen Lobel-Fried. It's a gorgeous book about a perfect day for an albatross on Midway. And it's a really nice and very optimistic introduction for children to the world of seabird ecology. So I use that a lot to just say, these are the kind of places that actually exist in our world. Like, you may not really think that they actually are out there, like these truly wild places, but they are. And I think that sometimes in science it's very important to have a sense of wonder and awe. And so I like to be able to share those stories when I can, but that's the kind of stuff that I've been doing so far. But I mean, I hope to do a lot more writing and also just like presentations with folks, and these kind of things are great. I mean, mainly the one thing that I really love doing with outreach is storytelling. I think that's a lot of fun, and there are so many great stories to tell about Midway. And I think storytelling is just kind of a natural way that people can connect and understand the world. And yeah, I look forward to doing much more of that as we learn more. So stay tuned.
And her Twitter handle, and I'll put a link to the book, but they're both down in the description. So go check those things out.
Thank you.
Yeah. Is there anything else about you as a scientist or as a person that I haven't asked you about that you think it's important for people to know?
I guess like the last thing I would know is kind of going back to the idea of advice, like to myself, but also to others, is that I think for a long time I've definitely struggled with the idea of being a scientist. And I've always thought of myself as just a really curious person, that I just want to understand what is going on in the world around me and how I can hopefully help in the process and not hinder things. So I think that that is something that I'm still learning about, but I also hope that folks see themselves like truly as scientists. I mean, if you're curious about something, you're a scientist. You're out there, you're observing, you're asking questions. So I hope to see like sort of like an empowerment and redefinition of what it means to be a scientist.
Yeah.
So that's one final note I'll leave on is we're all scientists in our own ways.
Yeah, you don't have to have it as your job title or your career in order to identify that way. Yeah. I like that. And this is the super cheesy ending question, and I know it's a little premature maybe because you're just starting your master's, but what is next for you? What do you want to do after you're done with your master's? Where do you see yourself going in your science journey?
Okay, well, I plan to spread my wings and fly away. No, I'm sorry, I had to do it. That's an excellent question. I am not totally sure what I want to do yet, but I obviously am a little bit obsessed with islands and seabirds. So I would love to continue down that route for a while and continue learning about these really intriguing systems, and also in light of restoration, like how can we really restore these lovely, lovely places that house an absolutely insane amount of endemic and biodiverse species. So I think I could see myself exploring that world for a little while longer. But I mean, I'm attracted to a lot of different ecosystems, especially like even back in my home state, the sagebrush steppe is a really neat and wild ecosystem that I would love to learn more about. So we'll see where I end up going. I'm just a curious person, so wherever the wind blows, I will go.
Cool.
Yeah, but I would hope to continue doing research for sure for a while. So.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to share your stories with us. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. It was fantastic.
Yeah. If you liked this video, don't forget to like it. If you didn't like this video, please share it with someone who would. And if you'd like to support the Roving Naturalist, remember to hit the subscribe button and the bell notification icon. You can also follow me on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.
Yeah, awesome.
That was awesome.
That was great.